Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jiller, and together with Mr. Eman and Miss Jessa, I am your presenter for today. Our topic is about the book authored by Mr. Jonathan Swift entitled Gulliver's Travels or Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. Before we start the discussion about the story, let me introduce to you first the genius behind the masterpiece. The picture on the slide is Mr. Jonathan Swift or Mr. Isaac Bickerstaff. He is also the author of other notable pieces such as The Tale of the Tub, which is about the three brothers, each representing one of the main branches of Western Christianity. The second one is the Draper's Letters, which is the collective name for a series to arouse public opinion in Ireland. The third one, which is our topic for today, is the Gulliver's Travels, satirizing both human nature and the traveler's tales. Lastly, the Modest Proposal, which is an essay suggesting that the impoverished Irish might ease their economic troubles by selling their children as food to rich gentlemen and ladies. Let's take a look on the brief history on the life of Mr. Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was born in Dublin, Ireland on November 30, 1667. His father died before he was born, and his mother left the young Swift in the care of his uncle. The family was not wealthy, but they had good connections. Uncle Godwin Swift took primary responsibility for the young man, sending him with one of his cousins to Kilkenny College. He arrived there at the age of 6, where he was expected to have already learned the basic declensions in Latin. He had not, and thus began his schooling in a lower form. Swift graduated in 1682 when he was 15 and earned his bachelor's degree from Trinity College. This four-year course followed a curriculum largely set in the Middle Ages for the priesthood. The lectures were dominated by Aristotelian logic and philosophy. The basic skill taught the students was debate, and they were expected to be able to argue both sides of any argument or topic. Swift was an above-average student, but he was not exceptional. He received his bachelor's degree in 1686 by special grace. He then moved to England, where he attended Hertford College at Oxford and earned a master's degree that would make him eligible to join the clergy, his backup plan to his political aspirations. And then, Swift was assigned as a parish priest for the Church of Ireland in Derry when he was 32. But he continued to work and write actively in politics. His first work of satire, which is A Tale of a Tub, was published anonymously in 1704 and expanded in 1710. This publication earned him the scorn of Queen Anne of England, who misunderstood the work even though Swift was active in English Tory party throughout the early 1700s, dividing his time between London and Ireland. And then, in 1713, he became a dean in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. But in the following year, unfortunately, the Queen died. George I took the throne, the Whig party dominated the English government, and these events effectively ended his hopes for advancement in the church or government. He returned to Ireland and focused his career on his writing, pouring many of his political opinions and experiences into his best-known work, Gulliver's Travels. When it was first published in 1726, Gulliver's Travels became an immediate success, with adults and children requiring multiple reprints in its first few months on the shelves. However, in Ireland, Swift remained politically active, writing pamphlets supporting Irish causes, such as Irish independence from British colonialism. The most famous of these, A Modest Proposal, published in 1729, brought attention to poverty in Ireland with its outrageous and sarcastic suggestion that starving Irish families sell their children as food for the wealthy English. These and other writings established Swift as an Irish political hero. His commitment to social good extended beyond his death through the money he donated for the establishment of a mental hospital in Dublin known as St. Patrick's Hospital, which remains in operation today. In his personal life, Swift cultivated friendships with other prominent literary figures, including poet Alexander Pope and playwright William Congreve and John Gay. His lifelong friendship with Esther Johnson, better known as Stella, has inspired scholarly and non-scholarly speculation over the years. In 1738, Swift began to show signs of illness, and in 1742, he may have suffered a stroke, losing the ability to speak and realizing his worst fears of becoming mentally disabled. He said, "I shall be like the tree. I shall die at the top." He became increasingly quarrelsome, and long-standing friendships like that with Thomas Sheridan ended without sufficient cause. To protect him from unscrupulous hangers-on who had begun to prey on the great man, his closest companions had him declared of unsound mind and memory. However, it was long believed by many that Swift was actually insane at this point. Then, on October 19, 1745, Swift, at nearly 80, died. After being laid out in public view for people of Dublin to pay their last respects, he was buried in his own cathedral by Esther Johnson's side in accordance with his wishes. So basically, that was the life of Mr. Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travel. Now that we are done discussing about the author, let's now open the discussion about the book. Originally, the title of the book is Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. It was a four-part satirical work published anonymously in 1726. It was a keystone of English literature. It was one of the books that gave birth to the novel form, though it did not yet have the rules of the genre as an organizing tool. A parody of the then popular travel narrative, Gulliver's Travel combines adventure with savage satire, mocking English customs and the politics of the day. Almost 300 years later, Gulliver's Travels remains Swift's most famous work and is a staple of the English literary canon. The novel has remained in print consistently since 1726 and has been adapted to picture books, comics, and a number of films, including a 2010 adaptation starring Jack Black. The novel also introduced new terms into the English language. For example, the word Lilliputians, it is derived from the 6-inch tall Lilliputians Gulliver visits on the island of Lilliput. It is used as an adjective to describe things that are very small, and the word Brobdingnagian, derived from the 60-feet tall giants Gulliver visits in the country of Brobdingnag. It is an adjective to describe something that is very large. Let's now discuss the characters of the story. The first one is Gulliver himself. He is the narrator and the protagonist of the story. Although Lemuel Gulliver's vivid and detailed style of narration makes it clear that he is intelligent and well-educated, his perceptions are naive and gullible. He has virtually no emotional life, or at least no awareness of it, and his comments are strictly factual. Gulliver never thinks that the absurdities he encounters are funny and never makes the satiric connections between the lands he visits and his own home. Gulliver's naiveness makes the satire possible as we pick up on things that Gulliver does not notice. The second character that we have is the Emperor or the ruler of Lilliput. Like all Lilliputians, the Emperor is fewer than 6 inches tall. His power and majesty impress Gulliver deeply. Because of his tiny size, his belief that he can control Gulliver seems silly, but his willingness to execute his subjects for minor reasons of politics or honor gives him a frightening aspect. He is proud of possessing the tallest trees and biggest palace in the kingdom, but he is also quite hospitable, spending a fortune on his captives' food. He is both a satire of the autocratic ruler and a strangely serious portrait of political power. Next on the list is the farmer, who is the first master in Brobdingnag of Gulliver. The farmer speaks to Gulliver, showing that he is willing to believe that the relatively tiny Gulliver may be as rational as he himself is, and treats him with gentleness. However, the farmer puts Gulliver on display around Brobdingnag, which clearly shows that he would rather profit from his discovery than converse with him as an equal. His exploitation of Gulliver as a laborer, which nearly starves Gulliver to death, seems less cruel than simple-minded. Generally, the farmer represents the average Brobdingnagian of no great gifts or intelligence, wielding an extraordinary power over Gulliver because simply by virtue of his immense size. Another character in the story is Glumdalclitch. She is the farmer's 9-year-old daughter who is 40 feet tall. She became Gulliver's friend and nursemaid. She hangs him to sleep safely in her closet at night and teach him the Brobdingnagian language by day. The Queen of Brobdingnag is also another character in the story. She is very delighted by Gulliver's beauty and charms that she agrees to buy him from the farmer for 1,000 pieces of gold. Gulliver, on the other hand, appreciates her kindness after the hardships he suffers at the farmer's hand and shows his usual fawning love for royalty by kissing the tip of her little finger when presented before her. On to the next list of characters, we have the King of Brobdingnag. He is, in contrast to the Emperor of Lilliput, seems to be a true intellectual, well-versed in political science, among other disciplines. While his wife has an intimate, friendly relationship with the diminutive visitor, the king's relation to Gulliver is limited to serious discussions about the history and institutions of Gulliver's native land. He is thus a figure of rational thought. Lord Monody is a lord of Lagado, the capital of the underdeveloped land beneath Laputa, who hosts Gulliver and gives him a tour of the country on Gulliver's third voyage. Monody is a rare example of practical-minded intelligence both in Lagado, where the applied sciences are widely impractical, and in Laputa, where no one even considers practicality in virtue. The next one are the Yahos. They are the human-like beasts who live in servitude to the Huens. The men are characterized by their hairy bodies and the women by their lower hanging breasts. They are naked, filthy, and extremely primitive in their eating habits. Yahoos are not capable of government, and thus they are kept as servants to the Huens, pulling their carriages and performing manual tasks. Huens, on the other hand, are considered as rational horses who maintain a simple, peaceful society that is governed by reason and truthfulness. They do not even have a word for lie in their language. Huens are like ordinary horses except that they are highly intelligent and deep-wise. They live in a sort of socialist republic with the needs of the community put before individual desires. The next one is Gulliver's Huem Master. The Huem who first discovers Gulliver and takes him into his own home. Wary of Gulliver's Yahoo-like appearance at first, the master is hesitant to make contact with him. But Gulliver's ability to mimic the Huem's own words persuades the master to protect Gulliver. Don Pedro de Mendez is the next character in the story. He is a Portuguese captain who takes Gulliver back to Europe after he is forced to leave the land of Huems. Don Pedro is naturally benevolent and generous, offering the half-crazed Gulliver his own best suit of clothes to replace the tatters he is wearing. The next one is the Brobdingnagians. They are the giants whom Gulliver meets on his second voyage. Brobdingnagians are basically a reasonable and kindly people governed by a sense of justice. Even the farmer who abuses Gulliver at the beginning is gentle with him and politely takes the trouble to say goodbye to him upon leaving him. The next are the Lilliputians and Blefuscudians. They are two different races of miniature people whom Gulliver meets on his first voyage. Lilliputians and Blefuscudians are prone to conspiracies and jealousies, and while they treat Gulliver well enough materially, they are quick to take advantage of him in political intrigues of various sorts. The two races have been in a long-standing war with each other over the interpretation of a reference in their common Holy Scripture to the proper way of eating eggs. Gulliver helps the Lilliputians defeats the Blefuscudian navy, but he eventually leaves Lilliput and receives a warm welcome in the court of Blefuscu, by which Swift satirizes the arbitrariness of international relations. The next one that we have are the Laputans. They are absent-minded intellectuals who live in the floating island of Laputa, encountered by Gulliver on his third voyage. The Laputans are parodies of theoreticians who have scant regard for any practical results of their own research. They are so inwardly absorbed in their own thoughts that they must be shaken out of their meditations by special servants called flappers who shake rattles in their ears. The last three characters in the story are Mary Burton Gulliver, Richard Simpson, and James Bates. Mary Burton Gulliver is Gulliver's wife, whose perfunctory mention in the first paragraphs of Gulliver's Travels demonstrates how unsentimental and unemotional Gulliver is. He makes no reference to any affection for his wife, either here or later in his travels when he is far away from her, and his detachment is so cool as to raise questions about his ability to form human attachments. Richard Simpson, on the other hand, is Gulliver's cousin, self-proclaimed intimate friend and the editor and publisher of Gulliver's Travels. It was in Richard Simpson's name that Jonathan Swift arranged for the publication of his narrative, thus somewhat mixing the fictional and actual words. Last one is James Bates. He is an eminent London surgeon under whom Gulliver serves as an apprentice after graduating from Cambridge. Bates helps get Gulliver his first job as a ship's surgeon and then offers to set up a practice with him. After discussing the characters of the story, we come now to the discussion of the symbols in the story. There are 5 symbolisms present. The first one is the Lilliputians, which represent the human tendency to consider themselves the most important creatures in the universe, but on the other hand, their tiny size and insignificance in the world as a whole reveals the error in this belief. For example, even after peace has been reached with the neighboring island of Blefuscu, the emperor is not satisfied with his victory. He wants to enlist Gulliver in continuing the war so he can take over Blefuscu. The emperor has little regard for his neighbors because his beliefs differ from theirs, and he thinks his own importance justifies the lives that may be lost in the war if the war continues. Second symbolism is all about the Brobdingnagian size that magnifies both their best and worst aspects, symbolizing how all humans have the capacity for great good and beauty, as well as ugliness and evil. For example, the farmer's family, who are the Gulliver's first acquaintances in Brobdingnag. They illustrate both extreme greed and extreme kindness. The farmer himself has no problem with exploiting Gulliver as a kind of sideshow attraction to the detriment of Gulliver's health. The farmer's daughter, who Gulliver calls Glumdalclitch, is devoted to Gulliver's care, even leaving her family behind to accompany Gulliver to the royal court so she can protect him. The third symbolism was actually about the Laputans. The Laputans' underground-dwelling counterparts on Balnibarbe symbolize the futility of seeking knowledge without the means or desire to put it to practical use. The Laputans show most normal human interactions, preferring a life of the mind, puzzling over mysteries of mathematics, physics, and astronomy all day. They are unable to construct sturdy homes, and their ideas often cause them stress, but they continue to pursue knowledge for its own sake. On Balnibarbe, the projectors engage in studies and experiments with the aim of improving the lives of their people, but their understanding of science and other topics is so incompetent and incomplete that they lack the ability to construct useful experiments or learn anything that might accomplish their goals. The next one is the symbolism on the Huems. The Huems symbolize the rule of rational thinking and the benefits of collective living, but also the loss of individual identity that comes with extreme devotion to reason. While rationality has allowed the Huems to construct a culture based on benevolence and friendship, peaceful and harmonious within, they are also overly beholden to the culture's rule and norms. Therefore, a recently widowed Huems does not outwardly mourn her husband's passing, but she also does not live long after him. The master and his family have affection for Gulliver, but social pressures force them to exile him. The denial of normal emotions prevent a full engagement with life. The last symbolism is found in the Yahoos. The Yahoos symbolize a complete loss of rationality in a primitive state. but they also show how ongoing oppression can drive humans into this primitive state. Yahoos have little and are subject to abuse, enslavement, and rejection by the Huens, which introduces a chicken and egg-like scenario. Are the Yahoos rejected because they are primitive, or are they violent because they have been rejected? Perhaps, as the Huans claims, the Yahoos are a lost cause. On the other hand, the Yahoos have very little means for survival, which drives them to extreme measures. After discussing the symbols found in the story, we come now to the discussion of its theme. The first theme that was identified was the might versus right. In Gulliver's Travels, it implicitly poses the question of whether physical power or moral righteousness should be the governing factor in social life. He experiences the advantages of physical might both as one who has it, as a giant in Lilliput where he can defeat the Blefuscudian navy by virtue of his immense size, and as one who does not have it, as a miniature visitor of Brobdingnag, where he is harassed by the hugeness of everything from insects to household pets. But alongside the use of physical force, there are also many claims to power based on moral correctness. The use of physical force against the Yahoos is justified for the Huens by their sense of moral superiority. They are cleaner, better behaved, and more rational. But overall, the novel tends to show that claims to rule on the basis of moral righteousness are often just as arbitrary as, and sometimes simply disguises for, simply physical subjugation. Claims to be moral superiority are in the end as hard to justify as the random use of physical force to dominate others. The second theme of the story, and thus also considered as the main problem or main conflict of the story, is the individual versus society. Gulliver's Travels could in fact be described as one of the first novels of modern alienation, focusing on an individual's repeated failures to integrate into societies to which he does not belong. England itself is not much of a homeland for Gulliver, and with his surgeon's business unprofitable and his father's state insufficient to support him, he may be right to feel alienated. He never speaks fondly or nostalgically about England, and every time he returns home, he is quick to live again. Gulliver never complains explicitly about feeling lonely, but the embittered and antisocial misanthrope we see at the end of the novel is clearly a profoundly isolated individual. Thus, if Swift's satire mocks the excess of communal life, it may also mock the excess of individualism in its portrait of a miserable and lonely Gulliver talking to his horses at home in England. The third and last one is the limits of human understanding. The idea that humans are not meant to know everything and that all understanding has a natural limit is important to Gulliver's Travels. Swift singles out theoretical knowledge in particular for attack. His portrait of the disagreeable and self-centered Laputans, who show blatant contempt for those who are not sunk in private theorizing, is a clear satire against those who pride themselves on knowledge above all else. Practical knowledge is also satirized when it does not produce results, as in the Academy of Balnibarbi. Swift insists that there is a realm of understanding into which humans are simply not supposed to venture. Thus, his depictions of rational societies like Brobdingnag and Huemland emphasize not these people's knowledge or understanding of abstract ideas, but their ability to live and their lives in a wise and steady way. To discuss the plot of the story and the last part of the discussion, I am giving the floor to Mr. Eman and Miss Jessa.
Thank you, Miss Delgaco. So now let's move on to the book, which is titled Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. The plot of the story. So first we have the introduction. The second, we have the rising action. Third, climax. Fourth, falling action. Then last is the resolution. Introduction. Gulliver traveled the world on several voyages aboard ship. Gulliver's Travels is the story of Lemuel Gulliver, a surgeon who takes to the seas. He completes many voyages without incident, but his final four journeys take him to some of the strangest lands on the planet, where he discovers the virtues and flaws in his own culture, comparing it with others. Sing action. Gulliver visits Lilliput, where people are 6 inches tall. Book 1. When the ship Gulliver is traveling on is destroyed in a storm, Gulliver ends up on the island of Lilliput, where he awakes to find that he has been captured by Lilliputians, very small people, approximately 6 inches in height. Gulliver is treated with compassion and concern. In turn, he helps them solve some of their problems, especially their conflict with their enemy, Blefuscu, an island across the bay from them. Gulliver falls from favor, however, because he refuses to support the emperor's desire to enslave the Blefuscudians and because he makes water to put out the palace fire. Gulliver flees to Blefuscu, where he converts a large warship to his own use and sets sail from Blefuscu, eventually to be rescued at sea by an English merchant ship and returned to his home in England. Gulliver visits Brobdingnag, a land populated by giants. Book 2. As he travels as a ship's surgeon, Gulliver and small crew are sent to find water on an island. Instead, they encounter a land of giants. As the crew flees, Gulliver is left behind and captured. Gulliver's captor, a farmer, takes him to the farmer's home, where Gulliver is treated kindly, but of course, curiously. The farmer assigned his daughter, Glumdalclitch, to be Gulliver's keeper, and she cares for Gulliver with great compassion. The farmer takes Gulliver on tour across the countryside, displaying him to onlookers. Eventually, the farmer sells Gulliver to the queen. At court, Gulliver meets the king and the two spend many sessions discussing the customs and behaviors of Gulliver's country. In many cases, the king is shocked and chagrined by the selfishness and the pettiness that he hears Gulliver describe. Gulliver, on the other hand, defends England. One day on the beach, as Gulliver looks longingly at the sea from his box, he is snatched up by an eagle and eventually dropped into the sea. A passing ship spots the floating chest and rescues Gulliver, eventually returning him to England and his family. Gulliver goes to Laputa, an island full of mathematicians. Gulliver stays home only a few months before shipping out to sea again. As ship surgeon on the Hopewell, on reaching the port of Tunken, the captain appoints Gulliver and a crew of 14 to take a sloop loaded with other goods to trade with some nearby islands. But after a few days of sailing, a storm drives the sloop far off course. To compound the problem, pirates attack and capture Gulliver and his crew. Gulliver, as captain, is set adrift, and he spies a great object in the sky, and an object which appears to be a flying island. The people on the flying island drop a seat attached to a chain to Gulliver, and he will coming. This rescue is lifted aboard. Gulliver meets the inhabitants of the flying island, learns that it's called Laputa, and immediately realizes that the inhabitants are distracted people who have a very limited attention span and very narrow interests. Their main concerns are essentially mathematics and music. Gulliver observes that Laputans, their clothes, which do not fit, are decorated with astrological symbols and musical figures. They spend their time listening to the music of the spheres. They believe in astrology and worry constantly that the sun will go out. The Laputan houses he notices are badly built, without accurate right angles. The Laputan women are highly sexed and adulterous, preferring men from the island of Balinbarbi. Laputan husbands who are so abstracted in mathematical and musical calculations don't know that their wives are adulterous. Gulliver visits Balnibarbi and sees projectors experiment. Gulliver's discontent with being on this flying island increases, and so he is lowered to Balnibarbi where he visits Munudi. At one time, the governor of the city of Lagado, Munudi shows Gulliver around the island, and a most unusual island it proves to be, except for Munudi's estate, which is flourishing and green. The land is completely eroded and barren. Munudi explains that everything changed after several people visited Laputa. These travelers came back dissatisfied with the way things were and established an academy of projectors. The objectives of the academy being to change the direction of all arts, sciences, languages, and mechanics, and to contrive new rules and new methods of agriculture and building. But none of their plans ever work. Now the land is unproductive. Munu's fields are bountiful because he follows the customs of his ancestors. Gulliver moves on to Glabdabrib, Longnag, and Japan. Gulliver visits Glabdabrib, an island populated by sorcerers. The governor of the island, who can make people disappear or return from the dead, invites Gulliver to visit with several persons brought back from the dead. Thus, Gulliver discovers that Alexander was not poisoned and that Hannibal did not use fire and vinegar to destroy an impassable boulder in the Alps. Caesar and Brutus are evoked, and Caesar confesses that all his glory doesn't equal the glory Brutus gained by murdering him. History Gulliver considers is not what it seems. Gulliver, continuing his interaction with those brought back from the dead, visits with Homer, Aristotle, Descartes, and Gassendi, and he also spends several days visiting with Roman emperors and with several rulers whom he terms as modern dead. He then focuses on modern history and is disappointed to find that these rulers have not been as virtuous as people have been led to believe. Finally, Gulliver asks to visit with some English yeomen. He is astonished to see that they are so sturdy. The race, he fears, has degenerated because of a rich diet and syphilis, and the current generation is a corrupt and degenerate as if they were nobles. Gulliver journeys to Langnag posing as a Dutchman, but he is discovered and imprisoned. The king sends for Gulliver and will learn about the king's idiosyncrasies. He requires those who have an audience with him to advance on their hands and knees and lick the floor. When a courtier is out of favor, the king sprinkles poison on the floor. Sometimes, after this ritual, Gulliver notes, the pages forget or carelessly neglect to sweep the floor, such as carelessness is fatal. Gulliver follows the custom and as a result of his willingness to answer questions posed by the king, Gulliver is invited to stay 3 months as a guest during his stay in Langnag. Gulliver hears about the Struldbrugs, people in Langnag society who are immortal. Gulliver's first reaction to hearing about the Struldbrugs' immortality is one of envy and enthusiasm because it would allow a person to gain immense wealth, wisdom, and a philosophical serenity. He fantasizes what he might do if he were one. However, when an interpreter explains the reality of life as Strasbourg that is grow old, feeble, decaying, and forgetful, Gulliver's enthusiasm for a life of immortality disappears as quickly as it began. At last, Gulliver is able to find a boat bound for Japan. In Japan, though he finds himself in trouble again, it is customary for Dutchmen in Japan to trample the crucifix, and none have ever protested doing so. However, the Japanese emperor excuses Gulliver from this ceremony. Later, a Dutchman again tries to have Gulliver forced to trample on the cross. Gulliver leaves Japan on the Amboina, bound for Amsterdam, and there he boards a ship for England. Finally, he returns to his family in Redriff.
And now let's go for the climax. Gulliver crew leaves him with the Hyams and the Owls. While Gulliver is a captain of a merchant ship bound of Barbados and the Leeward Islands, several of his crew became ill and died on the voyage. Gulliver hires several replacement sailors in Barbados. These replacements turned out to be pirates who convinced the other crew members to mutiny. As a result, Gulliver is deposited in a strand or an island to fend for himself. Immediately, he is discovered by a herd of ugly, despicable human-like creatures who are called. He later learns Yahoos. They attack him by climbing trees and defecating on him. He is saved from this disgrace by the appearance of a horse, identified, he later learns by the name Hoyam. The gray horse or a Hoyam takes Gulliver to his home, where he is introduced to the gray's mare or a wife, a colt and a foal or a chibrim, and a sorrel nag or a servant. Gulliver also sees that the Yahoos are kept in pens away from the house. It becomes immediately clear that, except for Gulliver's clothing, he and the Yahoos are the same animal. From this point on, Gulliver and his master, or the Grey, begin a series of discussions about the evolution of Yahoos, about the topics, concepts, and behaviors related to the Yao society, which Gulliver represents, and about the society of the Hoyams. So let's now proceed in following action. Gulliver wants to stay with Hoyams, but he is sent away. Impressed by the virtues of Hoyams, Gulliver decides to tell freely and truthfully, as much as he can about men. Gulliver has come to venerate the Hoyams and hopes to be able to stay among them for the rest of his life. But Gulliver cannot be absolutely truthful. He extenuates people's faults and overpraises their virtues. The more Gulliver tells, however, the more thoroughly he confesses his master that there are genetic and psychological links between humans and Yaos. Gulliver's attempt to become a Hoyam frightens a number of the horses. They reason that Gulliver is a Yao despite of his clothes, his bit of a reason, and the rest of his niceties, and they fear that he may organize the other Yaos and revolt. They advise Gulliver's master to either treat his strange pet Yahoo like a Yao or command him to swim back to his native land. Gulliver is thunderstruck. He would prefer death, but finally he resolves to sail to an island visible from the Hoyam coast. This decided, he builds a boat with the help of the sorrel servant. He covers the boat with Yahoo hides and caulks it with Yahoo fat. Then it is time for him to depart, and his last request is to be allowed to kneel and kiss the hoof of his master. And lastly is the resolution. Gulliver returns to England but despises Yahoo society. Gulliver sails to a nearby island where he is attacked by a naked savages and forced to flee in his canoe into the sea. Having nowhere else to go, he returns to another part of that same island. Coincidentally, a passing Portuguese ship sends a longboat to the island for water, and the sailors discover Gulliver. Gulliver trembles in fear but speaks to the sailors in their own language with neighing intonations. He is horrified to be a prisoner of the Yaos. Yet the captain of the ship, Pedro de Mendes, is kind. Gulliver is returned to Lisbon where Pedro de Mendes does all that he can to make Gulliver comfortable. Eventually, Don Pedro convinces Gulliver to return to his home in England. After that, Gulliver is happily received by his family for they think that Gulliver is already dead. But the reunion is a disaster for Gulliver. He cannot bear the sight or smell of his Yahoo-like wife and children. It is only after some time that he can bear to eat with them. To restore his mind, he spends much time in the stable. Gulliver swears that all he has related is truthful, and he wishes that all travelers were forced to take an oath to tell the exact and literal truth. He hopes that the example of the Hoyums will do the public some good. He only intends to make people wiser and better. He apologizes for not claiming his discoveries in the name of England, but he is proud that no one can accuse him of alluding to English politics in his writings. On a personal level, Gulliver is now able to eat with his family. Sometimes, he says he instructs them in virtue. So, the last view of Gulliver's home life, we watch Gulliver stop trying to become a horse. The scene is ridiculous as if it is Gulliver's final warning against pride. And the book ends on a note of deep irony. Gulliver is a prime example of the very pride he condemns. So I guess that would be the end of our presentation. Thank you and mabuhay.